Having this fountain here reminds me about how important water is for God's people. It reminds me about the many stories that we have throughout Scripture that involve water. For example, there's the importance of water in the creation story in Genesis.
But I think equally important is the story in Genesis of how God saves Noah and his family in spite of the destructive rains.
True. And speaking of salvation, there's the important story of Moses parting the Red Sea so that the Israelites could walk through on dry land.
And the hope of the parted waters of the Jordan, which welcomed the Israelites into the promised land.
Every week we're reminded of the sacramental nature of water when we think about Jesus' baptism at a font.
And one of my favorite scripture stories is when Jesus walked on the water and the water was calm.
That's a good one. There's also the great Presbyterian story of Jesus turning the water into wine at Cana.
And the promise of the living water for an outcast woman at a well.
You might say that the pages of Scripture are dripping with stories of water, right?
You might say that.
I might say that. I might say that. I think water is a really wonderful metaphor for something that is a really important part of faith, grace. I think water is a really important metaphor for grace. I'd like to explore that, but I think we need some help exploring that. And I would like to invite our elementary school age children, K through 5, to come up here and help us with that. Anybody who's willing to. Anybody is welcome to in K through 5. We need your help. Yeah. Y'all can come up and kind of gather around with us at this fountain here. Some of y'all go over with Elizabeth. She needs some company over there.
Come over with me. Thanks, Leah. You're the best.
Come on. Y'all don't have to stand in a line. Here, come over here. Come with me. Get closer. I want you to be able to see this. So when we look at the water in this fountain, there are many ways that it reminds us of grace. First of all, I want you to take your hand and try to get a little bit of water in the fountain and pick it up. What happens when you try to get water in your hand? What is it doing? It kind of goes through your fingers, right? Jordan, get your hand in there and see if you can get some water.
See if you can hold it in your hand, Jordan.
When we try to hold water in our hand, it goes right through our fingers, right? No matter if you tried to tighten your grip as tightly as you could, even if you tightened your grip, the water would still go through your fingers because it refuses to be controlled. We can't control it by holding it in our hands. Even beyond this very small example, when we try to control water, we have to use massive feats of engineering to build dams or to redirect water flow. It just doesn't seem to be something we can control.
And that's one reason water is a good metaphor. You know what a metaphor is? Yeah? You're getting there. You're getting there knowing about metaphors. A metaphor is something that perhaps stands for something else, right? So water is a good metaphor for God's grace. And one reason is that we cannot control water, and neither can we control God's grace. We may try to grasp God's grace, and we might want to hold on to it or channel it in a particular way, just like we have channeled the water. If you look at the fountain, and I know you were looking at it from out there, the water is channeled here, right? For now, but we don't know what will happen next with the water. And in the very same way, grace refuses to be contained.
Sometimes we might try to control grace. We might try to control it by limiting it, by withholding it from people we don't think really deserve grace. But God's grace doesn't really follow our rules.
Sometimes we might think we know who has received God's grace. Now, you might look around in here and think, she has, he hasn't. Would you ever think anyone here hasn't received God's grace? Sometimes, maybe in your classroom, though, you might be looking around and going, ooh, I'm not so sure about her. I'm not so sure about him. But the fact is, God's grace doesn't follow our rules. God doesn't think the same people are unworthy that we might think are unworthy.
And we might think that we are worthy and that getting grace means our lives should be super easy from now on. But that's not necessarily true either.
Because God's grace doesn't bend to our rules or to our wishes, and we can't hold God's grace any more than we can hold a handful of water, right? Okay?
Okay, now I want you to look at the top vessel. I'm going to call these things vessels. I want you to look at that top vessel. It was empty at some point, but now it's been filled up with water. What happens when that top vessel fills up with water? It spills out. Where does it spill out to? It spills out to one of these other vessels. What about when that next vessel gets filled up? What happens then? It falls down to the next vessel after that. Each time one of these vessels gets filled up with water, it overflows and spills over into the next one, right?
Okay, so what do you think happens when it all spills down to the bottom? What happens, Nathaniel? It's recirculating, it's coming back, right? And what does that say about God's grace? It keeps coming.
When
ends.
When it comes in abundance, it just spills over from vessel to vessel to vessel.
Yeah. And grace, like water, yearns to be shared. So once our emptiness is filled by God's grace, like this overflowing basin, God's grace spills out into the world around us.
When we recognize how much God has given us grace and the forgiveness that we've received, it's almost impossible for us to hoard God's grace.
And so, just as we see before us, it's going down, it's going down, it's going down. God's grace spills out of us and flows to the people around us.
It flows to other people when we offer them forgiveness.
Or when we show kindness.
It flows to other people when we confront hate or anger with love and compassion.
God's grace overflows from vessel to vessel to vessel. From Leo to Hugh to Jordan to Ellie to Nathaniel to Eston to Hugh.
Russ.
And then to Russ. And then what happens? Starts all over, right? Okay? So I think you're going to know a lot about this. Without water, there can be no life, right? Can you think of what kind of land mass do we call it where there is not much life? A desert, right. It's really dry in a desert, and so there are not many plants or even animals that can sustain life there.
What about parts of the world where there's a lot of rain? What do we call those? Rainforest, right? Tropical rainforest where there's tons of life and it's brimming over with plants and animals.
And drought, what happens when there's a drought? Okay, tell us about your project.
So what happens is all the land gets cracked and it just all completely dries up and all the animals don't have any food.
Okay, when there's a drought, everything dries up. The animals don't have water source. They also don't have food. So life can't be supported in a desert, right? Okay?
Water makes up a lot of who we are, too. Water makes up like 70% of what our body is made up of. From our cells to our organs, we have water flowing throughout us.
And without water, the human body can sustain life for only about 5 days. So keep drinking water, okay? Keep drinking water.
Y'all, just as life can't exist without water, in the same way, it can't exist without grace.
Because our lives are built on a bedrock of God's life-giving grace, whether we know it or not. Sometimes we don't know it, but it doesn't matter whether we know it. Our lives are built on God's grace.
In the book of Ephesians, it says, "You were dead through your trespasses and sins in which you once lived, but God, who is rich in mercy, out of great love which he gives us, made us alive together with Christ."
The old hymn that we will sing a little later on in worship this morning says it like this: I once was lost, but now am found.
And the piece of scripture that Elizabeth read a few minutes ago said, "For by grace we have been saved." God has chosen us to be saved for life. Another thing that you may not see in this particular example of water, but another thing that always amazes me about water is it's powerful, right? It can smooth down rough edges on stones and rocks. It can scatter soil all over the place. It can carve a path through stone. One of the most vivid memories that I have, raise your hand if you've ever been to a waterfall. Oh, y'all ever seen a waterfall? Okay, most of you. One of the most vivid memories I have from traveling around the world is going to Zambia with Andy Cotton and the Schaefers and the Lamberts and being at Victoria Falls. Victoria Falls is, by volume of water, the largest waterfall in the world. I remember standing there watching that water pour over the edge of the waterfall, this deafening sound that it made when it hit the bottom of the canyon, the spray that came up back in our faces. In fact, the spray from that waterfall goes so high and is so loud. In the original language, that waterfall is called the smoke that thunders. Water has an incredible amount of power that we can see in waterfalls.
And like water, grace is also very powerful. Like a river that Matt talked about that can alter an entire landscape, the impact of God's grace is also life-changing. God's grace transforms our lives.
It is power that we cannot fathom, and it's potential power that we see happening all around us in the changing of lives of people we know and people we see.
God's grace even has the power to transform us when we are broken into wholeness, and that is always important to us as God's grace moves from place to place to place. Now, some of you probably heard about, and most of you probably heard about, the epic house flood Skeet and I experienced about 18 months ago. You did.
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
The cause of it was a ruptured supply line to the washing machine. Now, those lines are very small, okay? It was not a big burst. It was not a big hose that burst, but we were out of town. We were out of town for a long time, for us anyway. And turns out the first person who discovered the flood was sitting up there with a big smile, Rebecca. That was Rebecca. And we had lost by that time about 50,000 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. And so Rebecca called her good friend Jane Boone and said, "Could you come over and bring a few towels?" We just need a few towels to dry this up. But what we determined and noticed was that because the water had been running for so long, the water on the main floor, the place where we eat and cook and watch TV and all of that, every single piece of flooring, the wood flooring, like down there, had buckled up. And then between the floorboards, and you can't even see any space between floorboards, the water had gone down into the basement of our house and gone down into the basement about this high in some places, okay?
Ooh.
And so there was water everywhere. It was in the cabinets. It was in cassette tape boxes.
Oh, yeah.
You know about a cassette tape?
I remember this.
It was in all of our favorite games like Hi-Ho Cherry-O, and it even had gotten inside picture frames. So it had destroyed the pictures because it was all under the glass there. And the water even had gone out the back door of the basement. So water found its way out.
You know what they say, water finds a way.
I expect that is more true than we can even know.
I expect.
So a tiny crack here or there, and water does find its way, carving an ever larger space for itself.
Even for this somewhat depressing example that Elizabeth has given us here, God's grace is like water, right? It comes to us when we don't ask for it. It comes to us unbidden. It comes seeping into the tiniest broken places of our lives. When we're most in need of God's grace and perhaps most unlikely to recognize our need for God's grace is made known to us.
Now, sometimes we recognize that we need God's grace. This is a tough time for us. And so we call out for God's grace and mercy. But more often than that, God anticipates our needs even before we do. And God fills up our empty spaces with grace.
Thankfully, there is no place that we can escape from God's grace and from God's kindness. So I want you to take a last look at this fountain. I want you to think of all of the things that we've talked about, all of the ways that water is like grace. I want you to remember trying to hold that water in your hand, the way it spills over from vessel to vessel, its power, the way it finds its way into all parts of our lives. And I want you to keep those images in mind. In a few moments, the ushers are going to be passing something around, and I don't want y'all to miss it. So y'all go back and sit with your folks, because that's going to happen in a few minutes, and I don't want you to miss it.
Thank you for
Thanks
your help.
for coming up. Thanks for your help.
So it is that we live within a comforting cloud of grace. We are always surrounded by God's grace, and God's grace is never beyond us. God's grace is always made known to us through Jesus Christ. We cannot even conceive of life beyond the reach of God. Indeed, we live by grace alone. During the weeks of Lent, we will look carefully at a variety of aspects of our lives and how we may respond faithfully to God's grace with our whole beings. We will think together about health and wellness, about God's good earth and time and talents. We'll think about money. We'll talk about relationships. We will consider together how every aspect of our lives and our life as a community can be employed in faithful response to God's grace.
For now, I'm going to ask the ushers to start distributing the things we discussed earlier. They're going to be coming around and handing the offering plates to you as if they are collecting offering. There are envelopes in these offering plates, and I'd like you to take one as it's passed around. Take one. I know it's going to feel weird to take something out of the offering plate, but take one of these envelopes as it's passed. I have a request. Don't open it yet. Don't open this envelope yet. We're going to be looking at these envelopes in a few minutes, but I just want to go ahead and distribute them now. And while they're being distributed in a moment, I'm going to be asking you some questions. I want to make sure we got that process going. Make sure you don't open them. Don't look in them. As you receive these envelopes, as you hold them in your hands, think about these questions. How would you describe God's grace?
And ponder this question: when are you frustrated by God's grace?
When are you especially aware of God's grace at work in your life?
Have you ever tried to walk away from God's grace?
How do you share God's grace with others?
Does everyone have an envelope? Hold it up if you have an envelope in your hand. All right.
Good.
We did it. Thank you,
Well done.
ushers. Now, I want you to take a moment and open the envelope and see what you have received. It is a gift. Like God's grace, it has come to you unbidden. The gift is unearned, unexpected, undeserved, and it is yours. Now, before you start looking to the left and to the right,
What did I get?
will tell
What did you
that
get? What did I get?
you all received exactly the same gift. Those of you who are new to the faith, and those of you who have experienced decades of faithful living, have all received the same gift. Those of you who have not embraced the faith we profess in this place, those who still entertain questions, and those who have resolved all the questions of faith, have received the same gift.
Whether you're 2 years old or 10 years old or 92 years old, you've received the same gift. First-time visitors in worship this morning and 50-year members of this congregation have all received the same gift. This gift is like God's grace.
It is unearned.
It is unexpected.
It is undeserved.
It's a little bit outrageous.
But unlike God's grace, this gift comes with one condition.
You are asked to use this gift thoughtfully.
For the benefit of someone else.
There are plenty of things that we'd like to tell you to do with this gift, but what you do with this gift is beyond our control, sort of like grace. While no other conditions are placed on this gift, we do have a couple of requests. Whatever you do, whomever you serve with your gift, invest yourself above and beyond this gift. Use this gift as a starting place for serving another person. Perhaps you could choose to collaborate with another person or two to pool your gifts to find meaningful ways to share your time and God's grace together for the benefit of God's people.
Perhaps your sharing of this particular gift will also give you an opportunity to tell someone why. To tell someone why you're doing this. Dare I say to a bunch of Presbyterians, maybe you will have a moment to speak freely of your faith in Jesus Christ and to speak of the grace you have received from Jesus Christ.
However you use this gift, tell us about it. Send us an email, tell us in person, be willing to tell others about it in worship. Share your stories of grace sharing with one another.
We have all received a gift which we did not earn, a gift which we cannot control,
a gift which we cannot possess or hoard,
a powerful gift,
an unexpected gift,
a life-giving gift.
the gift of grace.
How will we respond to this gift?